Thank you, Atia. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. My name is Camila Cruz, and I'm a junior at the college studying social studies and philosophy. I am also a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. Tonight, we have the distinct privilege of hosting a conversation with our distinguished guests, Lord Dominic Johnson of Lainston. Lord Johnson of Lainston is a distinguished financier and public servant with a wealth of experience in both the private and public sectors. He served as Minister of State in the Department of Business and Trade from February 2023 to July 2024, following previous ministerial roles in the Department for International Trade and the Cabinet Office. Prior to his ministerial appointments, he built a successful career in financial services spanning over 25 years, beginning at Robert Fleming in 1995 and later working in Hong Kong with Jardine Fleming. Following involvement in several technology ventures, he led marketing at Lloyd George Asset Management, specializing in emerging markets. In 2007, he co-founded Somerset Capital Management, an employee-owned firm focused on pension fund management in developing economies. His commitment to public service includes tenure as a non-executive board member of the Department for International Trade, where he chaired the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, and as vice chairman of the Conservative Party from 2017 to 2019. In recognition of his contributions to business and trade, he was appointed a commander of the Order of the British Empire. This conversation will be moderated by Stephen Gibson, a highly regarded economist and regulator with over 30 years of experience in economic policy, regulation, and competition. He has advised regulators, businesses, and consumer organizations across a range of sectors, including post, water, rail, aviation, ports, energy, and telecommunications. A senior fellow at both the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and the London School of Economics, he is also a member of the Bank of England's Cost-Benefit Analysis Panel. In 2011, he established SLG Economics, an independent consultancy providing expert economic advice. His previous roles include interim chief economist at Ofwat, principal economist at Ofcom, and head of economics at Network Rail. He also serves as chair of the Regulatory Policy Committee, overseeing the independent scrutiny of government regulatory proposals. In addition to his professional work, he lectures in microeconomics at Birkbeck University of London. With his extensive expertise and measured approach, Mr. Gibson is well placed to facilitate a considered and insightful discussion. Before we begin, we would like to extend a special thank you to the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government for co-sponsoring this forum. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Lord Johnson of Lainston and Stephen Gibson to the forum.
Well, good evening, yes. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest IOP forum. And today we're going to discuss whether Doge can really reduce the costs of regulation and understand some of the lessons from the UK about what works and also what doesn't. So with me today I have Lord Dominic Johnson, and we've already heard all his work, both as in the financial services sector and also as a senior minister within the government, including, importantly, as Minister for Regulatory Reform, where we work together in my role as chair of the UK Regulatory Policy Committee, and I've seen firsthand the work he has done to improve the UK better regulation framework. So I can think of no one better place to talk to us today about some of the lessons learned from his time in government and the challenges of reducing regulatory burdens. And today I'd like to hear, and I hope we can discuss some of the challenges and some of the warnings for Elon Musk in his attempt to do some of the same and some rather different things at Doge. So, Lord Johnson, thinking about the UK experience, between 2017 and 2019, the UK government set out a target to reduce the burdens of regulation. It said it would reduce regulatory costs by £9 billion. Sounds very impressive. In actuality, they increased the costs by £7.8 billion. Okay? Then in 2019, the government once again set itself a target for regulatory burdens. This time it said it would hold the cost of regulation constant. But when we measured the outcomes, it ended up increasing the costs by £17.2 billion. So my first question is, why is it so difficult for government to reduce the cost of regulation?
Well, it's a great question. The first thing I want to say is thank you very much for having a good evening, everyone. It's an amazing privilege for me to come over from London and come to this incredible seat of learning. And I'm particularly delighted as a practitioner who failed spectacularly in my job as Regulatory Reform Minister to come and give you some practical advice about how we can do things differently and actually give you an opportunity to think, asking that great question, why? Which is what Stephen just asked me. We work very closely together in trying to improve the regulatory landscape in the UK. The long and short of it is we love regulating. People love regulations. And our entire system is designed to produce regulations. So I'm a legislator, I'm a member of the House of Lords. Obviously we have the House of Commons, you have Congress here. And what are we all doing? What are you writing to your representatives to do? Or what are the tabloid newspapers always calling on is for more regulation. And the challenge for the future is to find a regulatory framework that actually doesn't stifle growth, which is what's happening at the moment. Actually, excessive regulation is more than just a block or an annoyance. It is a very deadly, poisonous, colourless, odourless gas that is seeping into our economy and our very lives and truly shortening them, and also making it very hard for you as individuals to realise the best versions of yourselves. So this isn't just a dry technical discussion about how do you move the slider in one regulation or another. It's actually intrinsic to the survival of our nations and reflects directly back, in my view, on the political decisions that many people are making around the world. So the question why is at the core of it. I know we're going to cover some of the other ground, and I'm keen to hear from the audience on specifics. But the reality is a constant creation of competing regulatory desires that create a matrix that's very hard to operate in. So if I think of the costs in the last 20 or so years in the UK, the environmental costs are probably the most significant in terms of sort of obvious issues. The second is probably financial services regulation post the crash. So both of those two concepts, because they are so well intended, have had enormous consequences on people's ability to do things and take activity, and has resulted in so much cost that probably wasn't seen when they originally came into play. So you have pillars of themes that then create regulations that then cause further problems. And the final piece I'll say, and we may come back to this, is that the regulatory bodies themselves take on their own life. With enormous budgets and huge quantities of personnel, they start getting regulatory overreach. And their desire, and fundamentally the cultural desire, to reduce risk to zero means that these regulators are under enormous pressure to continue to regulate further than they probably should do, which causes distortions in the market and less good economic outcomes. And ultimately, because of that, you increase risk, because the risk you think you've dealt with actually squirts out the sides and creates unintended risks that is much harder to manage.
Right. So I absolutely understand that regulators want to try and reduce risk. I don't think they necessarily reduce the risk to zero, but how do they know when is the right level of risk for the economy, for the environment, for antibiotic-resistant bacteria, for financial services, etc.? How do we know as a society what is an acceptable level of risk when COVID pops up and everyone says, well, you should have known about that? Or the financial crash we had in 2007-8, we should have been ready for that.
Yes. Well, COVID is interesting because I think it's called the Disaster and Emergency Committee that meets, every government has them. And a pandemic was top of the list for the last 20 years preceding COVID. So everyone knew COVID was going to happen, but just no one did anything about it. So that wasn't a concept of the assessment of risk. It was a concept of the understanding of what you should do when you assess a risk. And it was considered to be too expensive, and as a result of which money, which should have gone probably into contingency planning, went elsewhere, because if nothing's happened, it's very hard to say we're not going to build a new hospital, we're going to plan for something that hasn't happened. And it goes back to politics. And the CEO of the FCA, which is our equivalent of the SEC, went to Parliament a few weeks ago and was lambasted by the members of Parliament for excessively constraining financial services in the UK. And he rightly said, well, I can change the rules, but you are going to have to accept there will be risks of market failure and company failure. And so what level of risk do you want me to take? And I thought quite intriguingly put the responsibility back on the legislator to say what level of risk. Because this guy knows that if some bank goes bust or a group of elderly pensioners are defrauded of their savings, that the headline will be screaming for him to have to resign. And really, culture is important, I think, and to be open as politicians that if you're going to have the freedom of the individual and a free market, you have to allow people to make poor decisions as well as good decisions. That's a start in trying to turn the culture around. And also making sure that regulation doesn't force companies and markets to become concentrated, because the only companies that can manage the regulatory risk have to become so enormous that they become too big to fail. And that's, in my view, what happened in the financial crisis. Because of excess regulation leading up to that point, the ecosystem of smaller companies where if they'd gone bust wouldn't have been such an issue was effectively concentrated because you couldn't survive if you were too small. So you need to think both about the culture and then the ecosystem of the environment you're trying to regulate in. And then the last thing I would say, which is very important, is you shouldn't confuse standards with regulation. Because obviously the antibiotic needs to be tested before it can be given to me. So saying that there's a free market and ultimately people won't buy antibiotics that kill you is absurd. But that's standards, that's not regulation. And we like standards. I think standards are very important. And industry standards are normally better and often better than those set by government. But regulation is effectively the structure that's used for the regulators to try to manage every element of their specific industry. And they can't do it. And an understanding of that fact in itself, I think, would help us a huge way.
In 2010, David Cameron came into power in the coalition government in the UK, saying that his government will be the first government to end up with less regulation rather than more regulation. And the way he sought to do it was to bring in a policy called one in, one out. Later became 1 in, 2 out and 1 in, 3 out, whereby any new regulation that was introduced had to be offset by a regulation that was removed. And in 1 in, 2 out, so every new regulation of equivalent value, it's not just the numbers, it has to be however many millions of costs you're imposing, has to be offset by double for 1 in, 2 out, the regulatory costs that you remove. So in the first Trump administration, the US had a similar 1 in, 2 out policy, which was then rescinded by President Biden. But Trump has now issued a 10 in, 1 out. So, 1 in, 10 out executive order. So in order to have any new policy, you have to remove 10 existing rules. Do you think there's any merit in this sort of mechanistic offsetting approach as a sort of gatekeeper to governments not just imposing regulation willy-nilly?
Well, I quite like it. I think it's rather bold, and I think you probably have to be bold. It's a very blunt instrument, though, to simply match regulatory principles one against another, because life isn't like that. You could have one terrible regulation and get rid of 10 quite sensible structures that would lead to an improvement in our lives or greater market operability. But it makes people think. And at the end of the day, if you can get your government systems to think constructively about what they're doing, then you're automatically, I think, winning half the battle. And there are plenty of other ways that you can improve your regulatory environment. You can make things proportionate. You can have a comply or explain process. You can use sunsetting, which is very useful because what is relevant today may not be relevant tomorrow, clearly, as technology and systems change. You can make the regulatory authorities put growth of the economy as a priority. And you can also look at you have to revisit what the principle of the regulation is about. So a particular issue for me are bats. I don't know, who likes bats here? Hands up if you like bats. Does no one like bats? Yes, there's a few people, they're cute. Yes, a little fairy with a little fairy ears and stuff. There are 3 people like, anyone else like bats? Put your hand up, don't be embarrassed. There's a few at the back, they like the bats. It seems to be a lot of people in the balconies like bats, but no one down here does. Well, I happen to like bats. I think nature's very important, my environment's very important. But I'm trying to, and this is just one isolated example, and I'll extrapolate it briefly if you'll give me a moment. I'm creating a working from home space about the size of this stage. It's in an old piggery, it's in an old shed near my house. And so I applied for planning permission and I get a letter back saying I've got to have a bat survey. Have I accounted for bats? Because if you knock down these old buildings, you kill the bats. So I said I hadn't. So I said, okay, that's fine, I'll get one done. This was in November, 2 years ago. But of course, it wasn't that easy. I couldn't do it in November 2 years ago. I had to wait until the bats were in the mating season to see if they were actually using it to form an intimate embrace. And so only between May and July do bats do this, I discovered. So I had to hire someone called Tristan who came, and he had his camera, he set up his camera to film the bat, sort of like filming, like making bat erotica in my loft. For 10 days at vast expense while he read his book while filming this. And then I got the report and it went to the council, and eventually, a few months later, towards just the end of last year, I got my permission. So the whole process took 1 year and cost me probably about $10,000. That's one tiny example. And to give you an example to make it more realistic for you, the train line between London and Manchester, they spent, guess how much on bat mitigation? Anyone have an idea? Yeah? Anyone? Let's shout out some numbers. How much do you think they spent?
A bat million.
A bat million. They spent $140 million on mitigating for bats. And my mitigation at the end of the process, when I got my document back, was to put a little bat box up just on the side of the building where they could nest, which is great. It cost £100, $125. Which I think is a good thing, by the way, for those of us who like bats. But how much better would it have been if we just said, OK, we want to protect bats in our environment, so if you're going to do some work on your shed, you have to buy a bat box and stick it on the side. That's the principle. We lose sight of what we're actually trying to achieve and invest too much in the process. And that's what companies, when I was investment minister, used to come and complain to me, was we lost sight, not of what the end goal was, which is to protect our environment, or to have ordered markets where consumers are protected, or whatever it may be. We looked at the process rather than the outcome. And that's what I want to force people to think about more. But blunt instruments at least make you think, and that's a good thing.
All right. So I can see where you're coming from there, but we have, as well as the new regulations, which the sort of 1 in 10 out sort of approach is trying to achieve, we have this huge stock of regulation on the statute book, a lot of which is time expired, a lot of which is no longer relevant. I mean, we still have regulations for fax machines. I mean, I can't remember the last time I saw or used a fax machine, and probably some of the people here don't even know what they are. We have things on our statute book that are just there, just making the legislative process more cumbersome. You have to, hire more lawyers to read more background regulation. But the problem is we have no mechanism for getting rid of them, even when their time expired. So one of the mechanisms that we discussed actually at the Regulatory Policy Committee is that all regulations have to have a time limit and a sunset clause. So whether it's 5 years or 10 years or whatever, and that doesn't mean that they suddenly fall off a cliff, because all you have to do then is do a review before that time and say, do we want to keep the regulation? Is it working well? Do we want to revise it because things have changed? Markets don't stay still, technology doesn't stay still. Or is it actually being either not used at all, or inefficient or ineffective, and we should just remove it? But government departments don't do that unless there's some reason for them to do it. These bills just stay on for 50 years, 100 years. So unless you have this force that if you don't do this review, the legislation's going to suddenly be sunsetted, then that would be an impetus for people to actually look at the existing statute book and think about so how we can reduce the burdens of it. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on those sort of ideas.
Well, I mentioned sunsetting as a very effective way of dealing with these points. And I don't know, I think it was either in the bar exams in the UK or at Oxford. When I was going through university, someone looked up all the old regulations around exams. And he's sitting there, this is a rather wonderful, a true story, and he put his hand up halfway through the exam, and he said, and the invigilator walked over and said, what do you want? He said, I'd like a pint of ale. And the man said, what on earth are you talking about? He says, well, if you look here, it says under the codicils that I'm allowed as an undergraduate doing my finals exams a pint of ale. So they went and got him a pint of ale. The next day he was fined £500 for not wearing a sword. So you've got to be very aware of your history before you start being too clever about it. But you're right, sunsetting is useful, because I certainly found in the few years I've been in Parliament that we're reacting to something. And often that emotional urge to regulate a certain specific thing goes away. And I think it's very important to constantly be reviewing your stock of regulations. Otherwise you get layering. But actually the real issue for me as a business person was the inconsistency of the regulatory environment. And that's what's caused so much cost in the United Kingdom, is that the regulations change and that they're inconsistently applied. So if you look at planning or financial services regulations, both of them change continually, and so you can't plan. And I think if anything, rather than just having a process to get rid of regulations you don't need, that you have a process to enforce consistency of regulation, that would probably be more valuable for me. But one of the things that we worked on, Stephen and I worked very closely when I was Regulatory Reform Minister, was on reviewing the existing stock of regulation. And not enough effort and attention is paid by the civil service in the UK, and probably not in the US either, in terms of combing through your statute books continually, trying to make sure that you remove regulations that actually impede economic growth and don't count for anything now.
One of the other ideas that David Cameron brought in was what he called the red tape challenge, rather, sort of not particularly creatively, but the idea was that he set up a website in 2010 where businesses and consumers could write in with their ideas for regulations that could be removed. Whenever I talk to businesses, they all want, in general, the burdens of business to be removed. But when I ask them, so which regulations do you want to be removed, I get stunned silence. How do we actually find out which regulations are the ones that are really unnecessary, causing unintended consequences, perverse behaviour, etc., and which ones that are protecting consumers and promoting welfare?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. There's an assumption, probably by you in the audience. So are you all doing government studies? This is a relevant discussion, I hope. You haven't just wandered in out of the cold. But businesses don't like regulation. That's actually untrue, in the same way that legislators like creating regulation and the public likes regulating. Businesses also like regulations because in many instances, particularly when you get to the very large organisations, it gives them an enormous protective moat in the sense that they're the only ones who can really deal with it. And so it's actually good for them. And there's an enormous industry, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry of people involved in the regulatory environment. So my friend who filmed my bats is part of a giant eco-army of people who live off these new regulations about newts and bats and biodiversity net gain and all these other things. So we're pushed bizarrely by the industry not to be clear about the sorts of regulatory thresholds that we want to try and reduce. And that's a big issue. But actually, if you get people in private and you find forums where people can make constructive input, I think you'll get them telling you the truth in terms of where regulation is really affecting them. And you have to be very specific also in trying to go down the food chain and finding smaller businesses and single practitioners and talk to them about the cost of regulation and the difficulties that they encounter. There's a very interesting statistic, which is that we have an HMRC, which is the equivalent of your Inland Revenue Service in the US. And the most popular day for small business people to file their tax returns and to do all their taxes is, anyone guess? Anyone know what the most popular day is? It's Boxing Day, because that's the only day they get when they're not working and trying to run their business, dealing with all the different regulations. It's the only free time that a small business person has. They've done Christmas Day and they've got one day off, and they use that to do their HMRC returns because they're so overwhelmed, I think, by the regulations that make their lives very difficult. And also, what we don't know are how many people are put off by poor regulation. And then the final thing I would just say, which is really relevant, which goes back to the difference between the common law and statute law. And I think we're blessed in our nations by having a common law system, whereas the European model is a statute-driven system. And that's what regulation effectively is. It's statute rather than common law. And we should look far more clearly to common law in answer of how we regulate our businesses, because culture and behaviour always beats regulation every time, in my view. And as a result of which, if you can find ways to use common law to force behavioural outcomes, you use guidelines to make sure that you have quality and reduce the concept of statute or regulations, you immediately will have better outcomes where people can interpret how they should fit in with the specific legislation, deliver good outcomes for the consumer, but know that there's a framework around which they can be managed.
Okay, so no one doubts the potential benefits of removing unnecessary regulation. I mean, the costs that impose are clearly huge. But isn't there this danger that everyone worries about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, about recklessly removing important consumer protection or safety regulations? How do we rapidly cut burdens, or how does Doge rapidly cut burdens without putting people at risk, without putting our services, our health at risk, without putting our environment at risk?
Well, I think you would. It's against the law to poison someone or to defraud them. You know, the law doesn't change. It's how you interpret the regulations and how the regulatory authorities interpret their activities. And I think you do need to be pretty focused in changing the culture of the regulatory environment, where you put growth, economic growth, and the opportunity for businesses and people to succeed ahead of your desire to have implemented processes. And that's going to be tough. I mean, I was really intrigued over the last few weeks. I've been watching very closely what Elon Musk is saying and doing and what Doge is doing. And I'm quite envious of him, having been regulatory reform minister myself. I'm very envious of him, of the enormous amount of power and authority that seems to be vested in him. And I'm excited by the debate this is going to create. And I think any politician in any country around the world is looking with particular interest at what he can achieve. Because I say this, and I know I've got colleagues in the audience who've been in government as well, in executive cabinet positions. It's extremely difficult to reform the regulatory environment. And as I say, I was successful in many of the things I did in government. As investment minister, I think we had a really good stream of successes in terms of bringing money in. But I was uniquely unsuccessful as regulatory reform minister, because I wasn't able to have the power and authority to change the system enough to liberate the economy underneath it. And I think if we don't do this, then we will see the continued decline of our economies. And the one thing I'm worried about most is that my children, I'm the first generation since 1750 or whatever, where my children won't have a better quality of life than me. And I truly pin that down to excessive regulation, excessive bureaucracy, and a state that is smothering us with good intention. And it behoves us as politicians to stand up against that and explain to people why this is wrong, reform it, allow us to have the freedoms, whilst at the same time within a structure that allows for market confidence and good outcomes.
Right, so to come back to our title, you brought in Doge here again. So based on your experience in the UK and what we've heard already from Elon Musk and President Trump, do you think that they will be able to really reduce the costs of government regulation here in the US? And what are the pitfalls of doing that?
Well, I think I can't think of a single pitfall that would befall this nation if you reduced bureaucracy and you managed to get your regulation more in tune with economic growth. And the same in any country. I think it will be extremely difficult to do. And I've noticed that in the chain of events over the last 10 days or so, I think that originally Doge had access to Treasury documents, and now that's been rescinded. There are a number of moves being made to prevent him and his team from accessing certain departments and so on. And the system is resisting. It's suffering from significant organ rejection. And the thing that I'm most intrigued by is the speed at which they're trying to act, because they know that if they take time over it, then the system itself will react against you. Because the constituencies supporting every single regulation are gigantic. Literally, I went through a myriad of single regulations, and each time there was a constituency of people who were resisting me from changing it, whether it was civil servants, other politicians, pressure groups, interest groups, or whatever it may be. So you have to move fast, very fast at the beginning, announce what you're trying to do, which in itself creates cultural change. And I'm afraid, there will be a great deal of friction around this, because the system is designed to self-perpetuate. And I realized when I was one evening, I was particularly frustrated. I think it was to do with the fact that we were bringing in the pet abduction bill, which I think we talked about earlier, which was going to give you 2 years in prison if you fed somebody else's cat, as an unnecessary piece of regulation. And I sort of went home and looked very glum, and my wife pointed out to me that you're trying to confront a system that spent 150 years defeating you. You've been doing it for one. So it's not surprising that you're going to find it very difficult. But ultimately, you have to go in with a very radical view of what the state should be. And it's not about one person's view of something. It's about how it should best serve the citizenry. It's all about service to you, the people. And it's not responding effectively enough to give you the services that you want. And public service delivery failure, which is a fundamental response to the regulatory environment, is at the root of many people's dissatisfaction with politics at the moment. And the reason why so many young people, by the way, this isn't old retirees, this is young people, want to have stronger, more authoritarian candidates in power, is because they feel that nothing can be done because of the weight of the bureaucracy. So that's why I said at the beginning, this isn't just a debate about the niceties of a specific technicality around securities law. This is the very essence of our survival as a nation. If we don't break this, then we're not going to be able to survive, and/or we're going to have political outcomes that we find undesirable because people are so frustrated at the system that's acting against them.
Great. We've now got a chance to open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions for Lord Johnson, there are microphones at the bottom and at the top on both sides. Please come up to the microphone. Please announce your name and your affiliation when framing your question. And please remember that questions are questions, not statements, and questions end with a question mark. So can I invite the first gentleman here to open the question?
Hi, I'm Blake Burkett. I'm with the Senior Executive Fellows Program. And my question is, how did the regulatory environment change as Brexit happened and you moved out of the EU?
Yeah, that's an exceptionally good question. And it's really interesting because there was an assumption that voting to leave the European Union would somehow free up the United Kingdom to forge its own regulatory path. And what happened? Anyone know? Well, it just turned out that regulators can speak English as much as they can speak French or German. And we had our own civil servants who were even better at regulating than the Eurocrats were. And we ended up with more regulation that cost us more than we had when we were in the European Union. And I think that led to a great deal of dissatisfaction, by the way, from people who voted for Brexit, who feel they didn't get it, which to some extent I think can be traced to the electoral outcomes for the Conservatives, the party I chair. And it's very frustrating that we didn't use that opportunity, really, to release ourselves from the statute-driven social democratic principles that occupied Europe, when frankly we should have done and been a lot braver. What's intriguing for me now about Europe is you see the proclamations from the leadership that even they understand, and I do say this, slightly derogatorily, frankly, even they understand that excessive regulation is killing the European economies, and they have to do something about it. So I've often thought tomorrow, so I'm going slightly off the topic, but tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher becoming leader of the Conservative Party. So, and there's a range of products in the Conservative Party shop, ranging from Margaret Thatcher pyjamas through to mugs, which I will for any Thatcher enthusiast. The great question is, did Margaret Thatcher change the world, or was the world changing and Margaret Thatcher was the right person at the right time? Because it happened in America as well under Ronald Reagan, but in a slightly different way. So is this a cycle now that we've thankfully entered into, where we're going to start reversing the principle that huge amounts of regulation is a good thing, and actually less regulation, smarter regulation is better? I rather hope that this is the case, but sadly our leaving the European Union didn't give us the regulatory arbitrage that we thought it would.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Alexis. I'm at the Graduate School of Education. So my question is more along the lines of, you kind of alluded to this in your envy of Elon having this amount of power that he's given to do the things that he's doing. And so it kind of made me think about a question: at what point does the motivations of reduction impact outcomes? So for example, there may be consensus that there needs to be regulatory reform. However, depending on the person chosen to complete that task, things can lead to undermining of social systems, or it could lead to uplift. And I kind of see that all as like woven into the fabric of like the economy. So I kind of wanted to know your opinion around motivations and outcomes.
So that's interesting. If I get, I'm not sure if I got the question completely clearly, but I mean, I think that obviously the person driving the agenda is going to be very relevant in the sense that they have to have an agenda to do it. And it's important that they have a clear vision in terms of what they want to get to in terms of savings. But I think that it's really relevant not to confuse deregulation with smarter regulation. Because if we look at, let's say, the water industry in the United Kingdom, which is perceived by the public to be very inefficient, there's a great deal of disgruntlement about how water companies have operated. One of the biggest water companies, is well publicized, is going through a great deal of financial volatility. And that's not about more or less regulation. It's about smarter regulation. And in fact, what they have to do in order to be awarded their mandates has increased and increased and increased in terms of the detail, but the big picture has been lost. So it isn't just tearing things down. It's also about saying, how do we actually make the system work? Whether you're looking at monopoly industries, which is very important for many of the ways we receive our services, and particularly things like power and water, or whether you're looking at broader markets like financial services. But you have to look at the impact of the regulation and then try and work backwards. So if we look at financial services, it was decided, frankly, as a consensus after the financial crisis that banks shouldn't be allowed to lend money. I mean, that sounds very glib, but what's resulted in the UK is that the banks haven't been able to grow. They can't grow their loan book because of the way it's calculated against their capital adequacy. And so lending has squirted out the sides to either grey area loan sharks or private equity lending or capital lending in other different ways. So that's had, in my view, a negative on the market, because you've removed a great deal of expertise, you've removed the amount of liquidity that can go in the market because of the way the regulations worked in that sense. So I don't get totally beholden to tearing things down and closing things down. I think you need to look at things in a bit more of a sophisticated way, because ultimately, in order to have confidence of markets, you have to have a regulatory structure. And if you don't have that, then you're losing the whole principle of the market in the first place. I don't know if I've answered your question. Do you want to ask it again? Ask it again a bit more clearly, because I think you're trying to edge me into something here.
No, it was a straightforward.
Okay.
I said,
I see conspiracies at every turn.
I said, at what point does the motivations of reduction impact outcomes? And you were kind of itching at it when you said, like, the person having an agenda. And so we understand that America and societies in general, can be UK or wherever, there is an agenda for the person who is given this goal of reducing all of these government efficiencies. And so I'm asking you, at what point do those motivations impact outcomes? Because even though these might be on their agenda, doesn't mean that the outcomes are what's necessary for everyone. And so I kind of wanted to hear from you about, like, the motivations and setting agendas.
Yes.
In particular about Doge.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Doge's agenda, as far as I read it, is simply to reduce cost and to use assessing the regulatory structures in the US bureaucracy in terms of how you can reduce cost. And I like that. I think focusing on reduction of cost is very important. If you reduce the fundamental burden of the bureaucracy, you immediately put money back into the economy, which can be invested far better. So you're going to get economic growth. And ultimately, with regulation, less is more, in my view. And that's why I say I think it's okay to go slightly further than you may wish to and grow it back, because that in itself will allow you to see what you have to end up with. And ultimately, reduction of bureaucracy fundamentally benefits the citizen and the society, because you're not negating the principles of the common law around which the regulations have been drawn up. It's still illegal to poison people or defraud people or to bankrupt people illegitimately. That doesn't change. It's just how it's implemented and the feature creep these regulators have engaged in, and the nature of the bureaucracy that feeds upon itself and grows as a result by feeding off the economy in a very disingenuous and unhelpful way.
Should we take one from this side?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Varun Gupta, I'm a Master's in Public Policy student here. Something I wanted to ask you about was communication strategy. And what we notice with regulations are a huge amount of inertia, even from those that say they want change, are quite resistant to change when they actually see it. So something I wanted to ask you about was, how do you communicate with the people that, reducing regulations is necessary? Do you need to do it in a way that, Musk and Doge is doing it in, like, a very public and very controversial way, just so that it stays topical? And in your experience, has kind of dying down into the shadows meant that regulatory change is not able to happen? So just generally, like, communication strategy to convince the public that regulation change is necessary.
Yes, I think it's essential. I think what Elon Musk is doing is absolutely right in the sense of making sure that it's a public display of displeasure at the feature creep of regulation over the last 30 years. The view that it's gone too far, and we have to be smarter about how we regulate our economies, otherwise we're not going to be able to grow, and the realization that's having negative effects on people's lives and how also they view their nation and how they can operate. So yes, I think you have to be very public, because it allows the people to behave in a different way. As I said at the beginning, I have great sympathy with the people who run our regulators in the UK. They're good people. You know, they're not bad people who creep into the office in the morning to try and destroy the UK economy. They would say, if you went to the head of the Food Standards Agency or the energy regulator, two particular chief executives who I have admiration for, they're trying to do a job regulating a highly complex environment. They're not trying to bring the economy down. But the pressures they're under by people like me, the hypocrites, the legislators, who bemoan regulation whilst regulating. And if anything happens, on the front page of the Daily Mail, which is the opinion former of the United Kingdom and drives all behaviour of politicians, that something must be done, we have to say loudly and proclaim it that the regulatory risk appetite fundamentally has shifted from zero risk to risk and managed risk. And if we do that, then you'll see behaviour change across the plateau, which will reduce the need actually to do some of the work that we're required to do in terms of sort of breaking down the regulatory structures. Yeah, it shouldn't be done in the shadows. It should be right out there. And it's up to us to provide leadership. That's how you change culture.
Hi. Sorry. I'm overcoming a cold, so apologize for my voice. Thank you for coming. My name is Toby. I'm a final year undergraduate, writing my thesis on David Cameron's administration. Do you view regulation as the key issue facing the United Kingdom today, and like by extension the United States? Or is it a sort of like low-hanging ideological fruit that politicians utilize to acquire support and say, there, we've done something, vote for us?
That's a very fair question, because if you go back 100 years, people were complaining about regulation. People have always complained about it, and politicians have always used it as an opportunity to beat the state, to bang the drum, to call for reform and change, and then didn't do anything, as Stephen pointed out. You know, we made a lot of proclamations and didn't actually do anything about it. But I do think, in truth, if I look at the issues that the UK faces that have driven political outcomes that are undesirable to me, it was the regulatory environment that prevented us from doing the things that we wanted to do to make people's lives better. And the clearest of that is building houses. We are far behind in building the housing stock in the UK that we need, which has caused enormous social and other economic problems. And the reason why we couldn't do that was because of the regulatory structures that we put around house building and how we manage that. We've reduced people's ability to operate. We've made the landscape very uncertain, very expensive. The rewards for property go to you know, they get heavily concentrated in the landowners rather than the house builders, so they find it very hard to operate. So yes, it's very hard for me to find a situation that I can't trace back to poor regulation. And I would also say something which I think is relevant, which is times do change. So if I look at the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, their job in the 80s was to make sure the markets were fundamentally fragmented, because that was what we believed was competition. If you had lots of people selling you glasses of water, you would have a market that would operate more efficiently and would be better for the consumer. But actually now, big tech, and I've got to be careful how I say this, but the reality is you need intensely concentrated pools of capital in order to develop the technology that we need to thrive and survive as nations. So actually the Competition and Markets Authority agenda needs to be turned on its head, but they're still operating as if they're in the 1980s. And we saw this with the Activision-Microsoft merger issue about 18 months ago, where they were bounced about all over the place because they weren't set clarity by the politicians in terms of what their regulatory structures and environment should be. But if we don't get this right, truly, if we don't do something about the regulatory blanket that's being placed on our activities, we are going to continue to see, because I believe truly this is the cause of many of our ailments, decline in productivity and a decline in the satisfaction and services that the public receive.
So if I can add something to your answer, if you think about what governments do, they basically do three things. They tax, they spend, and they regulate. Well, I guess they can go to war also, but let's hope we don't do that too frequently. But taxing and spending is really difficult. It's really difficult politically and electorally. It's really difficult because of the costs it imposes on society. But regulation is often seen as a free lunch. And I think that's where the problem comes. So some regulation is deliberately costly. So we think about, for example, tobacco regulation. The aim is to impose costs on tobacco companies in order to sort of make it more difficult to reduce smoking, to reduce the harms that are caused with it. But many times, the costs are not the aim. The costs are the side products. People want to make it food healthier. They want to make people have more information about what they're eating. They want people to know when they're buying a property if there are any sort of bats in the barns or any subsidence that's happened. So it's done with the best of intentions, but it does impose significant costs. And sometimes when we think about regulations, we don't look at the costs. We only focus on the benefits, and that's part of the problem. And government sort of thinks of regulations as a way of sorting out its problems without recognising the burdens it places across the environment.
I totally agree with that.
So, over here.
Hi, I'm Lisa Robinson. I've spent the past, 40 years working on U.S. regulations, so I know the U.S. regulatory system fairly well. I don't know the U.K. ones, so you'll have to excuse me if I'm getting confused. So much to say, not very much time, but let me clarify one point and ask one question. I don't know, 90%, 99% of what Doge is doing is not regulation. The 10-for-1 rule and the regulatory budget requirements. The responsibility for those is on the Office of Management and Budget, there's a process there and a group of people there. They'll be dealing with the same group that dealt with the similar requirements under Trump 1. Much of what you're describing, at least in the US, is not regulation. In my view, the biggest problems that relate to what you're talking about have to do not with 10-to-1 and regulatory budget goes regulation by regulation. But I think a lot of our problems have to do with integration across regulations, and some of the barriers to that have to do with the legislation, with what Congress has said, not with what the executive branch can do. So I'm wondering, how can we, you said yourself that 10-to-1 and the regulatory budget is a blunt instrument, but I'm wondering what other instruments we can use that would solve these problems of integrating across regulations and dealing with what Cass Sunstein calls sludge. I think you were talking about some examples earlier.
Yes, I mean, what we did in the UK is set up the Regulatory Policy Committee, which assessed the cost analysis of the departments when they looked at regulation. And I think that's very important. Ultimately, you're always going to underreport the cost of regulation. And because there's a political will to do something, you end up being slightly disingenuous. I mean that in the nicest possible way, because you can't show the true cost, but at least you can go some way to assessing how much it will cost, so that the public and Parliament can actually make a decision and realise what a catch is when it comes to rushing this legislation through, often relatively ill thought through. The problem is, we found it didn't work very well. And there was a great reluctance, and I assume that's still the case with the new government, to truly assess the cost of regulation on the economy. Very little time was invested in it. And Stephen's excellent committee spent quite a lot of time red flagging, I think it was called, the ratings, but no one took any notice of it. So we have to have a structure which actually has a lot more power for this junction box through which regulation goes, which pushes back on the regulatory desires, often of the legislature, as you say. It's Congress and Parliament that make these laws, that then get misinterpreted or overinterpreted, that causes the problems themselves. But that in itself is regulatory interpretation. One thing I would say, which I think is very relevant, is bizarrely, in the UK, and possibly to the same extent in the US, we've done everything we can to franchise out regulation and derogate ourselves from a responsibility chain as politicians. So hundreds of sort of quasi-autonomous governmental bodies are set up, which we don't have any power over, in which is vested all the power and authority to do the regulation, which sounds like a good idea because you want independence, but the reality is then they have no oversight and control and they're very hard to adapt in terms of the changing political landscape. So there has to be a way to reconnect us to this. And Kemi Badenoch, who was my Secretary of State, we worked very closely and was hugely supportive of the growth agenda that we had, has kind of co-authored one very important paper about this principle of the rise of the bureaucratic class, where you've outsourced power to these organizations who are now unaccountable but have enormous power over how we run our lives and how they regulate. And I think we need to restore that link. So if you think of, the first executive orders that will be signed by an incoming Conservative Prime Minister, not that I want to talk for her so far ahead of an election or set policy, but I would have thought definitely a thematic around that will be restoring control over many of these regulatory bodies and agencies, frankly, that have been allowed to run loose with no real accountability.
The thing I'd add to that is that governments don't always get it right first time, and that's not unusual. No one, you do your best, but for whatever reason you haven't got perfect foresight, and technology changes, markets change, whatever. The fallacy is to put in place a regulation and then ignore it, and then leave it. What you should be doing is monitoring and evaluating. So you put in place a regulation, you also put in place the systems to monitor, is it working well? Or is it imposing inefficiencies? Is it imposing costs that you hadn't expected or perverse incentives? And to then have a systematic process in place that reviews the regulation at repeated times to see, is it still working? Is it still achieving the objectives that we want? When we put it in place, we thought the benefits would outweigh the costs. Otherwise, why would we have done it? Okay? But the problem is the benefits and costs change as the regulation changes behaviour. That's what it's aimed to do. And if you don't keep an eye on those regulations, you end up with this blob of regulatory mass that just undermines the whole entrepreneurial spirit.
I totally agree. We've got another few minutes, haven't we? We've got 2 minutes, yeah.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I am Manuel Jose, and I'm studying, economics and government. So I have a strong interest in pursuing a career in both the private sector and the public sector. And you have been very experienced in both of them. So I was wondering if there's any particular mindset or framework that you utilized in the financial industry, in the private sector, that was later useful for deregulating the government or thinking about the public sector?
That's a good question. I have a governmental colleague here. Nothing prepares you for government better than watching Yes Minister, if you have an opportunity to watch that fabulous satirical show done in the 80s, which is still as true today as anything else. I think that my business career helped me be unafraid of change. And because I was put in as a specific minister from the House of Lords, I was much less worried about my political career because I didn't have one. That was the only job I was ever going to do, which I think is very helpful. And a lot of my colleagues in all parties, I think, find it hard to make the changes they need to do for a number of really interesting reasons. We haven't covered this, but the fact is the average tenure of a British minister is 11 months. That's the last 30 years. And in fact, many people serve for less than that. In the UK, we can only pick ministers on the whole from the House of Commons, so you have 200 or 300 people to pick from. Half of those probably are either retired or too new, so you've actually got a very small pool of people to pick from to run these government departments, which ultimately does the regulation. And bizarrely, domain expertise is actually frowned upon rather than encouraged. So I was one of the few ministers who had domain expertise. I was brought in to be investment minister, having run an investment management company and done that part. And I knew the client base, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. But most of my other colleagues had no knowledge of their department or area. And in fact, as I said, if you were a doctor, they tried not to put you in the health department because they thought you might try and know what you were doing and would interfere. So they sent you off to the defense department or transport. So we ask ourselves, why isn't it working? And at the same time, by the way, of the 5,000 people in my department who theoretically reported to me and my Secretary of State, I had no power over firing them, I couldn't hire them, I couldn't set their terms of pay, or what their performance metrics were. So I had no control over anyone who worked for me. So it was the exact opposite of business. And at the same time, my average experience level would be 11 months, and I came from an entirely different industry to the one I was then managing. So we ask ourselves why things aren't working. I think we have to look quite carefully at how the executives function in terms of how their departments function too, and then how the civil service is constructed. in terms of driving motivators to get them to succeed, which clearly aren't in place. And so the system itself needs significant reform if we're to try and find a way through what I think is such a complex problem.
And one final question.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm a PhD student. I was wondering sort of how you see the role of like federal law playing in your deregulatory vision. And what I mean by that is we know that a federal judge ruled that what Elon and his team was doing was illegal in accessing the Treasury payment systems. And I hear you saying that, there's pushback and whatever, even among people who don't agree with your vision. Fine, I hear that. But they're doing things that are illegal. And so I don't understand how you square that with your vision.
Well, my vision is one where you have good regulation and you have the consumers are protected, the markets function effectively, and yet you can realize the best version of yourself or your business. And that has natural conflict because obviously there's such an enormous forest of regulation already out there, and you have regulatory bodies that you don't have enough control over, that you have to fight that. And it's natural, the system is going to protect itself. So at no point did I expect, I'm interested to watch how it's happened, because at no point did I expect that Elon Musk would have a free reign. And ultimately, we're a nation of laws, and you wouldn't think that would be appropriate in any event, because these things are more complex in the detail than they are on the surface. So it is a friction-full experience, this. Even if I look at the BAT legislation in the UK, if we tried to reform that, which we haven't been able to do, by the way, at gigantic cost to the economy and no benefit to the BAT, it would still be a friction-full process, even though we know that right is on our side. And it's right that that is the case, actually. But it requires strong leadership from the very top. And I think and I say this cautiously, because it's not for me, to make great comments about previous governments that I served under. But if I ask myself, why wasn't I able to do more to allow our citizenry to have better lives by regulating better? Because that's the job. We mustn't forget that. Our job is not to serve the regulator, it's to serve the citizen. The reason why I was unsuccessful was because I never had, from the very, very top, the support I needed. Kemi Badenoch and I worked very closely together. She was Secretary of State. But really it needs to come from the top, and the culture is set from the very top. And there was never enough focus on that, and we were towards the end of our term anyway. So friction is good, because it highlights the problems and forces behavioral change, that the regulatory environment has to respond ultimately to the principle of the economic growth of the country that you're working in within the right metrics in order to ensure that the markets can operate properly. And as soon as you go beyond that, just to satisfy your own emotional desire to reduce risk to zero, or to manage people's behavior in such a way that they can't make any bad decisions, then you are actually negating your responsibility to provide that economic growth. And I think that you need to be quite brave about calling that out. And I wish him the greatest of success. I know the system will do what it can to protect itself, and I'm really excited to see whether or not he can achieve on some of his goals, because I think the rest of the world is watching very closely.
Well, unfortunately, we have one regulation that we have to hold to this evening.
That's very good.
We have to finish in a minute's time, so I would like you to join me in thanking Lord Johnson for this evening's lecture.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you.